Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Patty Brennan Show. Whether you have $20 or $20 million, this show is for those of you who want to protect, grow, and use your assets to live your very best lives. Joining me once again is my friend and your friend, Gregg Stebben. Gregg, as you may recall, and I did podcasts during 2020 and 2021 titled COVID and Courage. And today, we're going to talk about a different kind of courage. Gregg, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And in person, by the way.
Absolutely. By the way, everybody, I have to tell you that Gregg is literally just off an airplane from Warsaw, Poland. Wait till you hear about what he's been up to over the last, what do you think, 9 months?
Since February 24th, let's just say, if that number rings a bell.
If it rings a bell, absolutely. And I got to tell you, Gregg, when I heard about what you were doing, I was A, impressed, B, a little worried, wondering what was it that made you go over to Ukraine, and what is it about the conflict that has, that has gotten you so personally involved? And by the way, everybody, just so that you know, in the meantime, Gregg has co-authored a book, and I got to tell you, this is pretty interesting also. Does Putin Have to Die? And the subtitle is The Story of How Russia Becomes a Democracy After Losing to Ukraine. Wow, that's a pretty radical statement. And I don't know you as a radical person, Gregg. I mean, if anybody stands for journalistic integrity, it is Gregg Stebben. So what's going on?
Well, it's, there's the 10-hour story, and then there's the 10-minute story, and I'll do my best to keep it, sound biteable. When the invasion happened, first of all, I'm of Russian descent, of Polish descent. I think I'm probably of Ukrainian descent. But when I was growing up, my grandparents who fled Russia as children, they were Russians because that's how the borders landed back then. And I'm going to tell you a crazy story, and I can only justify it in retrospect. I look back and go, why was this invasion so personal to me? I had been interested in Ukraine, certainly since the annexation of Crimea, since 2014. There were so many stories and kind of scandals involving Ukraine in the last few years, both on the conservative side and the liberal side. There's Hunter Biden on one side, Paul Manafort on the other side. So it had been on my radar. When the invasion happened, though, frankly, my biggest concern, well, I had two concerns. One was I did not like and have not liked for a long, long time the bullying of Russia and Vladimir Putin. He's a bully. And that just doesn't sit well. And I'm going to tell you a story about that from my own personal perspective that now in retrospect, I look back and I go, oh, this is kind of a family thing with me.
Got it.
But my first concern, not that I wasn't terribly concerned about Ukraine, but the first phone call after Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th of this year was to a friend of mine he's not an academic, but he has spent his life traveling around the world analyzing risk, political risk, for mining companies and things like that. So his understanding of the geopolitical world is profound. He's also Polish. He grew up in communist Poland, so his understanding of that part of the world is amazing. He also has an adopted family in Asia, so his understanding of Asia is profound. And I bring up Asia because my biggest fear on February 24th is China going to invade Taiwan tomorrow? And how will the world deal with two conflicts at once? And frankly, as bad as we've seen Russia can be, I think we need to think of China as 10 times worse. So that's really why I was so keenly interested when the invasion happened.
It's very interesting that you bring up China because, we're in convention season and I have been traveling also, different events, really good kind of in-the-know speakers, et cetera. And, you might know this, but John Emerson has been on the show as well. He's a really good guy, very knowledgeable, former ambassador to Germany when Russia invaded Crimea. And he has incredible insights into that whole situation, as well as China. Now, it was interesting. Within the span of about 3 weeks during this travel time, in one conference, the Forbes conference, which is a big conference, everybody that's anybody in the industry was there and speaking and talking, kind of behind the scenes,
Sure.
et cetera. And at that point, China was a big concern. It wasn't a matter of if China was going to invade, but when. By the time I got down to the Hall of Fame conference, and that was a smaller conference, there's only about 100 of us that have been admitted to the Hall of Fame, and that was an intimate meeting where we really got to get deep and real. And I was fascinated to learn that within the span of about 6 weeks, the China thing is abating a little bit. They're beginning to see what's happening over in Ukraine, and they're thinking, maybe we better not. And so I think of this whole thing as a game of chess.
Yes.
With our world leaders, and I find it fascinating. And I'm really interested in hearing your perspective because, and folks, you probably know this, but I'm just going to say it anyway. Gregg and I did not prepare for this. This is one of these things where it's two friends just talking about a trip that Gregg took. And I'm really interested in learning what you learned while you were over there, because you know a lot about Ukraine, some of the corruption that was going on over there, and where things might be going over in Russia. So tell us more.
Sure. So let me give a little chronology because I think it'll add some context. Shortly after the invasion, first of all, when the invasion happened, I began to say to my wife, Jody, like, I have to do something. I can't, we can give money, and we have given money, and, probably everybody listening and watching has given money, but I wanted to do more if I could. President Zelensky of Ukraine, as you may recall, shortly after the invasion, launched a website where foreigners could join their territorial defense, become part of their military. Mm-hmm. And I actually went online to see. I didn't think they were going to take a 60-year-old guy with a little bit of an extra stomach and put a machine gun in his hands, but I thought maybe they could use a communications expert.
Well, I was going to ask you, have you ever done war journalism? Have you ever been on the, okay.
No, and full disclosure, I've done nothing like what I'm going to describe in my life. I'm not even an incredible student of history. I've been interested, but more as I'm interested.
Yeah, you're a journalist.
I'm not an expert in any way, and I think people should take what my observations and the things I say through that context. But I was looking for ways that perhaps I could do something. I was willing to go to Ukraine if that would help with the war effort. I had a few other ideas that I pursued with friends from that part of the world. And then one day, this was a few weeks after the invasion happened, a friend of mine from San Francisco called me. He's an incredibly successful, wealthy Silicon Valley entrepreneur. For fun, he's an older gentleman. For fun, he likes to start little businesses because he likes to hire and manage people and inspire them. One of his companies is when you're traveling in Europe, there's these walking tours that you can take that are free. And then you tip the guide at the end. He owns one of those companies. And when COVID hit, he didn't want to lay all his tour guides off. So he built an online platform so that his tour guides could continue to do tours, but to an online audience. And you couldn't physically hand them a tip at the end of the tour, but he put a tip button.
Okay.
So people were watching these tours all over the world through COVID. He had a tour guide in Kyiv. And the day after the invasion, or a few days after the invasion, she realized she had to leave with her kids. Her husband was already in the military. And she went on the platform. She already had a following on his platform. It's called Beams, B-E-A-M-Z. It's beams.live. She went on the platform, and of course people were looking at her because she's in Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
And she just announced on the platform, I'm just going to turn on my camera as we pack to go, and I'm going to leave it on as we leave our home and try to get to the border. To get to the border.
Wow.
There's a tip button. The money, the support poured in for her. I don't know the amount, but if you lived in Ukraine, it was a lot of money. And of course, my friend's company, Beams, said, normally they take a percentage. We're not, it's all yours,
Right.
covered.
Sure.
We're going to take out the part for the credit card, but it's all your money. And as he saw that, he began to think, what else could we do to use the platform to raise more money for Ukraine? And a few days later, he contacted me with that question. And I said, well, I'm a journalist. I'm a radio guy. If you send me to Poland, I'll meet people while I'm there. I'll do a show on your platform every day about what I'm seeing and who I'm talking to. And we'll pick a cause or two and raise money for it. And so that's how I got there. His company sent me for a month, and I spent a month there reporting every day on what I was seeing and what was happening there, raising money. We were quite successful. Truthfully, I thought we could raise $1 million. We did not raise $1 million. Okay. We were not that successful, but we were quite successful.
So I have a sidebar question for you, and it may not be relevant, but do you know the languages?
No.
Okay, so
I speak English.
That's it.
And
okay.
a little Spanish.
All right, got it. Okay, that I was curious about that.
No,
okay,
no.
All right, that's right.
So I'm there, and he and I have a mutual friend who's Ukrainian, who introduced us to a gentleman by the name of Ilya Ponomarev, whose name is on this book. It's really Ilya's book. I helped him. A little background on Ilya, because it's really the rest of the conversation is really about him, and I've just been fortunate to be part of a team to accomplish something, frankly, working towards accomplishing something, frankly, quite extraordinary. He is a former member of the Russian parliament. In 2014, he was the only member of the Russian parliament to vote against the annexation of Crimea. One vote, it was his.
I remember this.
You can imagine how courageous that was. And, it's part of an early chapter in the book.
It's basically a death sentence.
It's basically, so the first question, of course, he says, everybody in the West asks me is, why am I not dead?
Right.
And so he, interestingly enough, because he grew up in a communist country, he became an entrepreneur in high school and started his first successful company. Then went on to have a successful career in business. He's young. He's 47.
Oh.
He had a successful career in business. He was starting or part of a company in, I think, 2001 that was launching an interactive TV channel in Russia. Their investor was Ted Turner.
Wow.
Big stuff, right? Ted Turner is flying to Moscow to sign the papers when Putin made his first pass at shutting down independent journalism. So, of course, Ted Turner gets to Moscow, goes, sorry, guys. Maybe I can talk some sense into this guy's head, but you're not getting a check from me.
Right.
And that investment completely died. And it was at that moment that Ilya said, I never, ever want the government to stop me from doing what I want to do again. And I don't want it to stop anyone else either. And that's when he decided to go into politics. So a few years later, he became a member of it's called the State Duma. It's like our House of Representatives. It's interesting. His district is, this part really threw me, and I'm going to be interested to watch your face as I say this. His district was the largest city in Siberia. When I hear Siberia, I think Gulag.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out the third largest city in Russia is in Siberia. Wow. And it's a beautiful place. It's cold.
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful place. It's called Novosibirsk, New Siberia.
Okay.
It's the Silicon Valley of Russia.
Wow.
So his district was the Silicon Valley of Russia. So if you represent the Silicon Valley of Russia, you spend a lot of time in Silicon Valley, USA, in Boston, in Austin, in Washington. So he's very well known in the United States. Which is a good thing because he was in a hotel in San Jose a few weeks after the vote on Crimea. He woke up, big time difference, and on his phone there were hundreds of text messages. And he went online, and it turns out two things had happened overnight. The first was that he was dead. He had been murdered by Crimeans, which makes no sense because he voted to support them.
Right.
So, but he's reading Russian newspapers, and
Yep.
Ponomarev is dead.
Yep.
He's drowned. They ran his car off the bridge that was recently blown up.
Oh, my
We can talk more
goodness.
about that if you want.
Wow.
And the next story is, even though he's dead, he's also been forced out of the country and can never return. So he's in a hotel in San Jose. His first reaction is his family. He has a wife and kids.
Yeah.
And then he checks his pockets and he realizes he has like $21.
My God.
He runs to an ATM.
They've frozen his accounts.
Of course. And he's talking to his wife. How do I get you out of the country safely? it's the Duma's phone. The phone goes dead.
Wow.
So, but here's the extraordinary part. And this is all in the book, by the way, and I highly recommend it. But then
Yeah.
I did help write it.
Sure.
He says once he knew his family was safe and he got enough money to know that he was going he had to run back to the hotel and check out. He couldn't even pay for another night. And I don't think he can go down to the concierge and say, can I stay another night without paying for it because I've just been exiled from my country? It's just, it's awkward, right?
Yes. A little bit. Yes.
So he had friends. He got some money. I think he slept in someone's car for a few days. And I think probably part of it was that maybe some people would say, you're not coming and sleeping at my house because they might come and kill me. Right. Anyway, he gets an apartment. He gets some money. He gets his family safe. And he said once he knew his family was safe, and I mean hours within learning that he can't not return home, he said it was the most freeing and liberating thing in the world. He was free. And he never understood how oppressive it was to live and try to succeed and try to fulfill your dreams in his oppressive motherland of Russia. And then what fascinated me, and it's written this way in the book, is then he then goes through a list of so many companies in the United States, especially tech companies, that were started by Russians who escaped.
Really?
Google.
No way. Wow.
And I can't even remember, but you know, Evernote, if you use Evernote, started. And I can't remember but so many Russians, because you know, early before this, when someone was what they call an oppositionist, they would just encourage you to leave if they didn't throw you out. So many people, particularly in the tech segment, would just leave and come here and then start companies. And in some ways, that oppression and then being set free, I think helped them succeed because they had thrown off the shackles.
Right.
And they were determined to live their best life in a free democratic society.
Think about how much of a drain that was, what the potential for the Russian people could have been if they could have stayed and done what they were able to do in the United States.
Right.
That is wild.
Yes.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
And we take it for granted sometimes, don't we?
Well, so let me get to that.
Yeah.
I spent a month in Poland in April and May, came home. So this Beams network or platform, the CEO of the company who had, asked me if I would go to Poland had said to Ilya as they got to know each other, why don't you just do a 30-minute show with us every week? So I would interview him every Thursday. And after a few weeks, and first I didn't really know what to expect.
Sure.
I read his Wikipedia page. I watched some speeches he gave in the U.S., what had others said about him. But I thought, another politician. He's just a Russian politician, right?
And you say that as a man who has interviewed a lot of politicians.
I have interviewed a lot of politicians.
You are in that world very nicely.
So I
that's
actually
great.
thought, how am I going to, what am I going to ask him every week for 30 minutes? Like, is he actually going to, but he's completely, he's a normal guy. He's very smart. He's very well read. I mean, not just Russian history, but, you start talking to him about something of U.S. history, and he'll start explaining things to you.
Wow.
Very smart. But I began to understand that he was up to something. So when the war broke out, by the way, if you're Ukrainian, see, here in the U.S., we think this war started on February 24th, 2022. To a Ukrainian, it started in 2014.
Right.
They've been fighting this war for years. We just,
sure.
It was a small, contained conflict. So, but when the invasion happened on February 24th, he's now a Ukrainian citizen. To get to a point or a question you had asked earlier, he has security provided by the Ukrainian government because his life is at risk. But he went and he signed up for the territorial defense or the military. The first day he's standing on a street corner in Kyiv with a machine gun, right? And he gets a phone call basically from I'm not sure if they were current cabinet members or previous cabinet members or a mix, but he ends up at a very high-level meeting and he proposes, remember he has a tech and a media background, he proposes that he start in Kyiv a TV platform in Russian that will beam on YouTube live reporting into Russia for Russians so they can hear an alternate point of view from the Putin propaganda machine. So he started a network called February Morning. And we'll get back to that too, because it's very significant. So in any case, he and I started doing this weekly interview. And as I began to understand, he had launched his own TV network. And there was it was clear there was a bigger plan. And when I began to understand the bigger plan, I said to him one day, we'd only known each other a few weeks. I said, I think I understand what you're doing. And I think it would be great if the Western audience knew you better. I think you should write a book. And he agreed. He, thought that was a great idea. Book in English, by the way. What I didn't tell him was that I had already gotten him a book contract.
Wow.
So if he liked the idea, it was a done deal. That's how we came to have a book. But the real story is that what was that bigger idea that he's working on? And it really is the core of the book, and it's summed up in the subtitle, the story of how Russia becomes a democracy after losing to Ukraine. He joined the Ukrainian military. He's still a member of the Ukrainian military. But if you ask him, he's not fighting Russia. He's not fighting Russians. He's fighting Putin. He's fighting fascism. He's fighting a dictatorship. He wants Russia to win. He's just defined win differently. To him, winning is Russia's a free country. If Russia can come out of this conflict with the will, really now the Russian people, to build a democracy and be a free country, then Ukraine wins, Russia wins, and frankly, almost the rest of the world wins.
Well, what's interesting about that is, from what I know, is that the Russian people are living their life. Things are humming along. They have no idea really what's going on in Ukraine. And by the way, life is pretty good, right? To your point earlier, they don't even really realize they're being oppressed, right? So the question would be, you got to get a lot of people on board with this whole idea of democracy.
Yes.
And by the way, again, who is the kind of the pillar of what democracy is about? It's America, and we're not a great example right now.
Well, let me play devil's advocate about that.
Okay,
I mean,
all right.
you
This is
just asked a
beautiful.
lot of great questions.
Sure.
Let's see if we can kind
All
of
right.
take care of them one at a time. To us, some of us, we have real political divide in this country today,
You bet.
right? I mean, I think it's fair to say we're recording this the day after the midterms, and we're waiting to, what is going to be the makeup of the Senate? What's going to be the makeup of the House of Representatives, the governors, and all that?
Yeah.
I'm concerned about democracy in this country, too. I think everybody should be. In fact, my brother looked at the subtitle of this book and he said, the story of how Russia becomes a democracy. Maybe the sequel can be the story of how the USA remains or gets back to a democracy. Yeah, I mean, I think those are great concerns. But let's not lose sight of something that's easy for us to lose sight of as Americans. We get to talk about these problems. No one shows up at your door with a gun or tells you have to leave in 24 hours. And no one ever said democracy was a one and done. Set it and forget it. And, you can go back and find lots of quotes about democracy and how it's a process. And sometimes you have to fight to keep it.
And it's messy.
And it's messy. What we're going through, I don't like it. But it's not unnatural to the phenomenon of democracy, because democracy only lives because of the will of the people who are living under a system of democracy. That's us.
Right.
And so if you voted, you began to participate. There may be a lot more you can and should do. But compared to what they see as democracy, we're living the dream. And I don't think we should forget that at the same time that we recognize there's work to do, just as there is, frankly, in any relationship. It's just a relationship that we have to take care of.
Well, it's interesting because Ilya was a member of the parliament, right? And I'm going to show you my ignorance. How did he become a member of the parliament? Was he voted in? How's that happen?
It's a great question. So let me answer that by telling you where I was until yesterday.
Okay.
I just got back from Poland, Warsaw, Poland. I went back. So I was there for a month. I just went back. Why did I go back? Because Ilya and 50 other previously elected, largely now exiled, elected Russian politicians.
Elected.
So this gets to your question.
Yeah.
Before 2014, I have a great video of Ilya talking about this. I'll do my best.
Sure.
But before 2014, generally people regarded Russia's elections as legitimate. They're not without problems. And can we relate to elections with,
You bet.
but,
Sure.
but generally considered legitimate. Not legitimate since 2014. And I be honest, I'm not sure what the relationship is between Crimea and that legitimacy. I suspect there is a relationship. I couldn't explain it to you. But if you were elected before 2014, you were elected by the people of Russia. If you were elected after, you were not elected by the people. You were. There may be an election tally, but it's a bogus election tally. You were handpicked, right?
Gotcha.
It's not a free and fair election. So he gathered 50 plus people who had been elected before 2014, so legitimately elected by the Russian people. And they formed a constitutional convention. Does that ring familiar to you since we're here in Philadelphia?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they met in Warsaw, Poland to begin forming a new government.
Wow. I just think about that, Gregg, and think, wow, you are a witness to history being made right before your very eyes.
It's the weirdest thing for a guy who was
Who just wanted to go over there.
was not my, as I have said to friends and family on January 1st, 2022, my prediction for the year was not, I'll go live in Poland for a year and report on a war. I never went close enough to the war zone to be in danger, but I did go into Ukraine, and that I would go back to begin watching a group of Russian politicians who'd been forced out of their own country to form a new government for Russia. And that was really my role. I took 150 pounds of books. Of course, we were giving books to people there. We wanted them to read it. But really my role with many other people was to be an observer of this and as you said, in a sense, be eyes of history for the rest of the world.
So I think the title is so interesting. So my question to you is, knowing what you know and what you saw, does Putin have to die?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'm going to answer that the way we answer it in the book.
Okay.
But first I want to give you the answer to the same question, or a very similar question. If you remember when President Zelensky was asked a few weeks ago, I don't remember the exact question, but something along the lines of, what happens to Putin when this is all over?
Sure.
Do you remember what he said?
No.
He said, I don't care. And I think that's the best possible answer, because we should all strive for a time when we just don't care.
Right.
Did he live? Did he die? I don't care. He's gone. He's no longer in power.
He's irrelevant.
That's exactly right. So in the book, I wish we had said it that eloquently. I wish we could have waited until now to just quote the president of Ukraine, but that's not how books work, right? That's how the internet works.
Yep.
And I want to be clear that this is really Ilya's book. I helped. It actually started as a book he wrote over a 10-year period in Russian. That was my beginning text, 700 pages.
I was going to say, Gregg, I can't believe how quickly you rolled this thing out.
The first draft happened in 6 weeks.
Wow.
So there was not a lot of sleep going on.
And I got to tell you, I've read some of it. It's really grabby. It's very well done.
He is an amazing storyteller. He's had an amazing life. He understands what's important and communicates it well, and I helped. So to the question of does Putin have to die, as we say in the book, it's up to him. He's got all the money. He's got all power. He can leave. He can pull out of Ukraine, and he can get on a plane, and he can go to some compound that he already owns or a new one he buys with a big wall around it and have plenty of security and protect himself for the rest of his natural life and probably his children and his grandchildren. That's his choice.
It's very interesting because when I was away, one of the people that I was talking with said something really profound to me. And what they said was, Putin has drawn his line in the sand, right?
Yes.
And it's all ego for him,
yes,
right? And he has to win, right, for his ego, et cetera. And also if he wants to live, right? So Zelensky has also drawn the line in the sand, and he also wants to win. And I think that, the recent talk, what he's been talking about is not only are we going to get our country back, we're going and getting Crimea back, because that's really ours.
Whoa. Let me help you here.
Okay, help me out.
You be glad I'm not Ukrainian.
Okay, all right, good, yes.
Ukraine getting their country back includes not Crimea. It's not their country back and Crimea. Crimea is theirs. And that's... You don't feel bad for what you said, because we're being bombarded with propaganda that makes us think that Crimea is somehow this gray area of sovereignty, and it's not. It's Ukraine's land. I'm not going to say it's always been Ukraine's land, because the history of which we try to capture here is many, 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 many centuries old. But Ukraine became a country, a sovereign nation, about 30 years ago. And there was an agreement that Ukraine would be part of it. And so when Russia took it, there was no basis for the annexation. It just was a political and military effort.
Yep, operation. And you said that earlier in the podcast, in terms of this war didn't start in February.
That's right.
It's been going on since 2014 from the Ukrainian perspective. And so what's interesting about that is that what you just said is so true, even, amongst those of us in the West. And so what this individual said was, when you look at this whole chessboard, okay, Putin, he can't win, he can't lose.
Right. But he can die.
He can die. Same thing with Zelensky. He can't win, and he can't lose, and he can't stop. Neither one can stop. And in today's paper, I showed this to you, New York Times as well as the Wall Street Journal both have had articles about this and talked specifically about this concept of peace talks. Zelensky is holding the line and saying, I'm open to having peace talks. I don't think we're going to have peace talks with this leader.
Yes.
We'll have peace talks with the next leader. And by the way, when that happens, this is what we want.
These are non-negotiable. These are there's a word for it. I can't think of the diplomatic word. The preconditions.
Correct.
Are frankly the preconditions that anybody with any sense of righteousness, a moral background, and a sense of fair play would agree to. They want their country back. That means including Crimea. They want reparations for the damage that's been done. They want war crimes for, terrible things have been done there, atrocities. And there's one or other 2 points. But there's nothing you or I wouldn't ask for as well in the face of this set of circumstances. Those are the preconditions. Now, it's interesting, and I want to segue a little bit here maybe, but, they're called appeasers, people who, just give them a little something and they'll go away. The problem with appeasement is, I believe, is if Putin gains an inch, it's positive reinforcement for him. Right. It's positive reinforcement for China. Because look, what happened a few weeks or a month before this invasion? Remember, there was the Olympics in China, and China and Russia, Putin, Xi Jinping, we're brothers. That wasn't the exact term, but it was. So, and look, Xi Jinping's way smarter than Putin. Mm-hmm. I'm sure the deal was like, Putin's a little brother. You go try it. See what happens.
Oh, 100%.
And, if it goes well, we're taking Taiwan. If it doesn't go well, sorry, buddy. You're the one who...
Yeah, you did it. It's your...
Yeah, you own it, but... we're going to change our course because we learned from you. Mm-hmm. So if Russia gets an inch, it messages China, it messages North Korea. It just sends and there's a lot of dictators we don't even talk about. Right. It sends a message. It's okay. It's even if you kind of lose, you're going to win. So that's one of the reasons so many people in the West, diplomats, generals, military people, political people all over the West say, well, not only say, but it's why all these governments are backing up Ukraine. It's about Ukraine, but it's also about us. And if you flip that and you look at it a different way, and this is how I look at it, we should be thanking Ukraine for fighting this war for us. It's a proxy war. They're doing it for us. And thank God they have the resilience and the determination and the willingness to fight this battle because, another opponent. Look, I do believe that Putin thought that Ukraine would fall in 3 days.
Sure.
And he basically took Crimea and there wasn't much of a fight.
Mm-hmm.
But what did the Ukrainians do when Crimea fell? They didn't say, boo-hoo, darn, that wasn't fair. I'm going to call my therapist. They started training to be a better military and be prepared for when it would happen again.
Interesting.
So to bring it back to Ilya, when that annexation happened and he was the only vote, I guarantee you, if you were alive in 2014, you saw him on TV talking about it because every BBC, every TV network and every newspaper in the world spoke to him about it because he was the only one that opposed it. And one of the things he said over and over and over again was, this will lead to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And when it does, I'm fighting for Ukraine.
Wow.
Yeah.
That, again, courage. Talk about
but
courage.
also just understanding the culture.
Right.
There's no way that this is the end. This is the beginning.
Yeah. And and Putin showed his hand, right? This is the intention. We're going to go. And I find it so interesting how he justifies it, too.
Yes. You mean the mosquitoes this week? I can't remember. It's the LGBTQ communities. I'm so threatened by mosquitoes and people who are gay.
Right.
I'm terrified. Right. I mean, it's absurd.
Ridiculous.
But it makes sense to his base because, to go back to something we spoke about much earlier, they've lived in a world of oppression where information is largely controlled, and so they can't objectively, they can objectively, but it was very difficult and maybe even dangerous to look around and question authority and then find other information so that they can think about things on their own. And the culture around them has been designed to give them no reason to do that.
Right.
So something I didn't understand until I got involved is if you go to Moscow or you go to St. Petersburg, like living in San Francisco, restaurants and clubs and cars and clothes and nice apartment, but not the rest of Russia.
Right. Is it still that way after all of our sanctions and many of the companies moving out? Is it still that way?
Well, I think they're struggling and they are losing access to things. But you don't wipe out a lifetime of brainwashing in 9 months.
Right.
Because they're still being brainwashed. There's no other
input.
Objective. Yeah. So the night before I left Poland, I was with a friend of mine who also grew up in communist Poland. And she was taking me a walk around the neighborhood she grew up in. And I'll just tell you a couple stories she told me because it just blew me
interesting.
away. So Poland is a fascinating case study in how a country goes from communism to capitalism or dictatorship to democracy. And one of the things she said is, on the day of the change, and there was many years of work to get to that moment, but on the day that we were no longer part of the Soviet Union and we were a free nation, she said, my family was not very political. I was not very political. She was young. She was a teenager. She said, but my mother and I used to listen to this radio show every Sunday or Tuesday or whatever day of the week it was. She said, and we turned on the radio that morning and there was nothing there. And she said, we lived across the street from a government building and there was nobody there. That's how dramatic. The government controlled everything. Everything. And how can you and I, how can people watching and listening to us even comprehend that? We have debates in this country about how big should government be, and we have no idea how big government could. And I'm not landing on one side or the other. I'm just saying, you want to see a big government? Talk to my friends who grew up in communist Poland. They'll tell you what a big government looks like.
Wow, that's
and
so
how
interesting.
Happy they are that that's no longer the system that they live in.
Okay, so I'm not a history person. Okay, so how long ago was that? How long did it take for the Polish people to say, "Oh my goodness, we could start our own radio station"? Oh
Well, it
my
wasn't that
goodness.
easy.
Yeah, I'm sure.
First of all, so again, I'm not a scholar, and I'm learning. They
We're
say
both.
I'm learning as I go.
Yep.
And I wish you had been with me this evening that I was with her, because I learned a ton.
So
But there was, you remember probably from your teenage years or when you were in college, Solidarnosy, solidarity.
Yep.
That was a
Oh,
union,
yeah,
a workers'
definitely.
union.
Sure.
And she and I spent a lot of time the other night talking about it. I know some things about it before, but the union movement in Poland was so strong that it was actually able over years, not months, years, finally gain enough power to push the Soviet Union out. So I think that took a period of like 9 years. They lived under martial law for 9 years.
Wow.
I mean, I knew that there had been martial law.
Sure.
I thought a couple of months.
Yeah.
A summer. Oh, that would be such a horrible summer if you had martial law, right?
Yeah, totally.
9 years, I think she said. But years. And that's the kind of work, frankly, and sacrifice that you have to make if you want to make this kind of dramatic change in your country.
Well, it's interesting because then fast forward to Russia and this goal, this ideal that Ilya has. I mean, it's going to take a lot of buy-in
Yes.
from the Russian people.
Yes.
And it's a much bigger country,
Yes.
much more spread out, to get that message to say it's going to be messy, but when we get on the other side of this, we are going to be a better nation, much more, well-respected and back in the world, not feared, but,
Yes.
but cooperating, collaborating.
Partners.
Right,
Yes.
with the rest of the world.
So how do you do that?
Yeah, tough.
I've got to read my book. No.
I gotta read it. Man, that is really interesting.
So it's interesting. By the time we got to the end of the book, I felt like, the book's his history of the Soviet Union, how you do this, and it's a mixture
Sure,
of things.
sure.
I think it's a good read.
Yeah.
But I felt by the time I got to the end of the book that there were things in his head I had not drawn out yet. And the way we addressed that was the last chapter of the book is an FAQ.
Oh.
And so I had just asked him the questions that I had, and he answered them. And I think it takes everything that came before and wraps it up with a bow. I love the end it's essentially the end of the book. And the second to last question is basically, what you're describing is a revolution. And he says, yes. And then the next question is, does the revolution have a name? Because revolutions, if it's really a revolution, we have to have a way to refer to it, right?
Sure.
And he says the name of the revolution is the New Russian Revolution. And then the last question, and you are the leader of the New Russian Revolution? And the last word of the book is yes.
Wow.
Wow. It's bold. So earlier in that FAQ, I asked the same question you asked. What happens the day after Putin's gone? The week after Putin's gone, the month after, what happens?
What a mess.
And again, I think he answered it in the best possible way he could. It's tempting to say it's going to happen like this, and it's going to happen like this, and it's going to happen like this. We don't know how it's going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen. But there is a plan. Will the plan be executed as we planned it? No.
Probably not, no.
Am I going to tell you the plan? No. But there is a plan. And so when this Congress in Poland over this weekend came together, when he first told me about it, for me, it was like suddenly my brain was full of oxygen because it was the first time I saw a manifestation of his plan in the world, huge manifestation in the world, as opposed to things that people behind the scenes were talking about. Suddenly, reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and Newsweek, there's all this interest in this event because it's really happening, and it's not trivial. It's significant that Russia now has a government that is legitimate.
So this is a question, and I should probably know the answer, but what is the Like, how long is Putin in office? Is he there indefinitely? And again, I'm asking the question with the understanding that you may not know the answer, but it's really interesting. Is there going to be another election? Is that the way that he got into office? Or is it kind of like the thing in China where Xi Jinping was pretty much a shoo-in?
Anointed,
Yes, he was anointed and he anointed himself and yada, yada, yada. So I'm just curious, could there be a natural event for him to be unelected?
Well, unfortunately,
Yeah.
so he just turned 70 on October 7th. And if I'm correct, I think his term ends in 8 years or something like that. I mean,
man.
a long,
Yeah.
not
soon.
not next week,
Right.
and not next year.
Right.
So, but also you also have to also understand that he's already been in office longer than the term limit of when he took office. Gee, how did that happen? Well, when you're a dictator, you just change the terms.
Right.
So, was he elected? Yes, he was elected in 1999 or
Yeah.
2000. The country was in an incredible state of disarray. You know, the Yeltsin plan was unsuccessful. People were really hurting in Russia. And by the way, even in Poland, you know, as my friend said, you know, they're in really good shape today. But and this was about 30 years ago. I mean, but there was a long period where the people of Russia were really, really struggling and hurting. But unlike the people of Poland,
right.
Unlike Russia, they stuck with it.
Right.
And they probably, frankly, had a better plan, untainted. So part of Ilya's plan, which, again, it's in the book, and it's a very important part of the book, is that his vision is that there will be an interim government for Russia that serves for a contractually legal period of time, which he suggests is 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
So there'll be a president or whatever they decide to call their leader and a cabinet. And those people they'll have many things to do, but the primary function is new constitution, which they began working on this weekend, new laws, new judicial system, and free and fair elections. So within 2 years, we're going to elect our next leader. For now, we have this interim government. All of that is exactly as you would expect, except for one wrinkle. And I don't think this is original to them. I think other countries have done this, but it tells you the character of him and the people he's working with. Once that interim leadership team hits that 2-year mark and there's an election and there's a transfer of power, those leaders may never participate in Russian politics again for the rest of their lives.
Wow.
And why is that important? Because what happened with Yeltsin is they designed a government that served the people in power. And if you know you're not going to be in power anymore after 2 years, there's no motivation to do that.
Right.
And corruption is a huge, 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 huge part of the problem. Maybe it's the biggest problem. I mean, it's really what makes the oligarchs and gives Putin, you know, his riches and his power. And so you have to find a way systemically to wipe that away and eliminate the risk it will ever happen again.
Wow, that's so interesting. That is fascinating. And I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm just going to ask it, and it's a rumor, and I'd just be interested at your quick answer. I heard a rumor that actually Putin is sick.
Okay.
And this is his last stand. Eventually he's going to die just because of whatever it is that ails him. Is there any truth? Guys, this is a rumor, and I don't mean to feed into rumors, but since I got Gregg, I'm going to ask the question. What do you think?
So, I mean, first of all, I have no
Sure.
no knowledge of that. I can tell you I've had this conversation with Ilya. So first of all, on October 7th, which was Putin's 70th birthday, Ilya predicted, as he had been predicting for many months leading up to the birthday, that it would be Putin's last.
Interesting.
We sent Vladimir Putin 5,000 birthday cards, basically saying, is this going to be your last? Maybe if you leave, you can live to see a few more. 5,000 birthday cards. That's a lot of birthday greetings, isn't it?
It sure is. Wow.
So, but Ilya's take, and I think it's a pretty realistic one. And there are, you know, you can go online and see shots of Putin's hand where maybe he had an IV. And I mean, you know a lot
Yeah,
about this.
yeah,
This
yeah,
is from
sure.
your past life. You know, there's other pictures where he's bloated or he's holding onto a table. I mean, there's lots of circumstantial evidence that might suggest that he has some kind of terminal illness. It's also important to remember that the Russians, as one of their primary things, have been very, very interested in and have invested a lot of money in extending life, in age reversal. So I think if Ilya was here, and I wish he was, because
Yeah.
he'd be a way more interesting guy than me or the
Oh.
two of us. But I think he would say, you know, maybe he's sick, maybe he's not. It doesn't look like he's going to die anytime soon. It's not going to impact what happens next. You know, he's either going to leave or, to get back to your question about the title of the book, does Putin have to die?
Yeah.
He can leave or he can choose to die. Well, if he chooses to die by staying, how's that going to happen? I think the consensus is that someone very close to him, around him, is going to pull a trigger, you know, tie a knot in a rope, hit him with a chair, disappear him, because he is not just a threat to the Ukrainian people. He's not just a threat to the Russian people, but he's an incredible threat to the people who are right around him. So when you think about him talking about nuclear war, I mean, if you're within 15 feet of him, aren't you thinking, I don't want to die that way, and the only way I can stop it is to stop him?
Right.
So the first time I asked Ilya about this, he said something that was so out of a Russian novel that I loved to quote it. You know, I said, how does this war end? And his response was, the last shot fired will be in Moscow. You know, Vladimir Putin's greatest risk is not the Ukrainians.
Right.
It's the people around him.
Very interesting. Well, with that, Gregg, we're going to wrap it. Boy, talk about putting a bow on this thing. Oh, actually, before we do that, do you ever worry about your safety? Do you ever
You know,
think about
I wear a
that?
seatbelt. Is that what you mean?
Okay. All right. Fortunately, we live in America,
Yes,
right? And
yes.
fortunately, you are, you know, I mean,
I think about that question. You know, people have
sure.
asked me that. I mean, my name's on the cover of the book.
Yeah.
And frankly, I did ask myself, you know, I put my name, you know, when I sent the first draft of the book, I'm the one who typed with Gregg Stebben. And I did wonder to myself, is this a good idea? And then I realized, to know what I know, to have done what I've done, to help him write this book, to the degree that I can help by having my name on the book. It wasn't out of ego or anything like that. But, you know, I mean, people in media know me. I'm doing radio interviews. I've done some TV interviews. I thought it would be the ultimate act of what's the opposite of cowardliness to write this book and stand for this change in Russia and not be willing to put my name on a book that, frankly, I made happen. You know, it's Ilya's book, but it wouldn't have happened without me.
For those of you who listen to our podcast, and if you go back to one of our prior conversations with Gregg, we talked about what Gregg's goals were. Gregg retired. And in that podcast, you talked about your 5 goals. So let's go back to that podcast and those 5 goals. I remember it, especially number 5. And it kills me to be having this podcast today knowing that that conversation occurred. And here you are fulfilling it. Why don't you explain to our listeners and our, viewers, what were those 5 goals and what has put you in the position to allow you to fulfill the goals?
Yeah, well, you've had a huge influence on me in number 3. So I don't know how much time we will spend talking about it, but
Sure.
I want you to know, knowing you has made a big difference in my life.
Thank you.
But we'll get to number 3 after number 1 and 2.
Yeah,
So
totally.
number 1 was my priorities in life.
Yeah.
My wife, my dog. Number 3, our financial well-being. And, I've learned so many things from you, in our conversations in front of a mic and off of our conversations and things.
Totally.
I know you have this impact on people. It's your mission.
Thank you.
And I know that. And I know that you've had a huge impact. So that was number 3. Number 4, I have a family member who's been ailing for some years, who's like a sister to me. And so her care and well-being is also very important to me. Number 5, though, was kind of a personal breakthrough for me. Because I've always been a little bit of a Don Quixote, and I'm going to go chase that windmill.
Right.
And frankly, sometimes it's worked out well. Sometimes it's just been a fleet of fancy. I don't regret it.
Sure.
But I kind of reached a point in my life where I decided, let me be a little more choosy about my windmills. So number 5 is save the world, but only if you can. And so when that invasion happened and I looked at, my communication skills, my journalism skills, my willingness to jump on a plane and go to Poland for a month, my willingness to go to Poland for a weekend, and I think I have some valuable insight and frankly willingness to really work my butt off. I thought this might be a place where I could help save the world. And it's really number 3 and number 5, because if I hadn't taken care of the money, I could not have afforded to really follow this dream of mine. If I die tomorrow, I just want that book right here. Because it is what I've done in association with this is frankly the singular most important thing in my life to me, other than marrying the woman that I married. I would never give this up. And so how could I not put my name on it, to answer your earlier question? I want to live to see a free, democratic Russia. I know my grandparents would be so proud. I know my parents would be so proud. But mostly, I want to walk down the streets of Moscow and know I can say any damn thing I want and do anything I want, within the confines of society, and know that everyone around me has the same rights. That was saving the world, but only if I could. And it turns out I got to make a small contribution.
It's amazing. I literally just got tears and, welled up in tears and chills. It's an amazing story. And I think what makes it even more so, Gregg, is you didn't just write a book. You're out here. You're here in Westchester, Pennsylvania today with me doing a podcast so that we could share that message to everybody. All of you who are watching and listening to this podcast today, this stuff is important. It's important for the world. It's important for America, and it's important for all of us from a economic perspective, a financial perspective, and also a human perspective.
Yes.
That human element is one that we can never lose sight of.
Can I add one more story before you wrap this up?
Go for it.
So when I decided I was going to go to Poland for a month in April, one of the things you quickly learn is that people in that part of the world communicate through apps like WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram. So I'm adding these. I've had these apps on my phone before, but here in the West, we don't really use them. So I've never really had, been a regular user. I put, I think, WhatsApp or Signal on my phone, and within a minute, I got a message. And it was from a guy in Ohio named Joe. I think his last name is Palmisano. I'm going to talk to him later today. And I want to tell you Joe's story. So I've met Joe over the phone a few times over the years. He worked for a radio station. And I saw his name pop up, and the message was, "Are you in Ukraine?" I'm like, talk about spies.
Yeah, you're not kidding. That's
So when you sign up
wild.
for these apps, it goes through your contacts and tells anybody that is also using the app that you're now using the app. And my name popped up on his phone. Now, you may not like that, but that's another debate. He saw my name, remembered it from, I think the last time I talked to him was in 2016. He remembered my name. "Are you in Ukraine?" I write back and I go, "How did you?" I recognized his name. "How did you know?" And I'm almost tempted to pull out my phone and read. Can I do that?
Yep.
So I'm just going to read you Joe's message. "Gregg, are you in Ukraine? This is Joe Palmisano, formerly of WHBC Radio in Canton, Ohio. I just spent almost 2 weeks in Ukraine. I went on my own, unattached." This was around the same time I was thinking about joining the military. It never occurred to me to just get on a plane and go, right? Joe
Right.
just got on a plane and went.
Wow.
But wait. "Essentially grabbed a shopping cart and began walking. Ended in Ukraine, wherever buses dropped off women and kids. Filled my cart with their luggage and walked them across 2 borders to the buses taking them to safety. Did it over and over and over again each day. Gave each family $100 and all the love I could. Exchanged numbers and have stayed in touch with most. Did it every day until my 69-year-old post-radiation body couldn't do it any longer. Home now, but my heart is still there. I was known as the cart guy.
Wow.
He was 2 weeks out of radiation therapy for prostate cancer when he went.
Amazing.
Amazing.
Just amazing that people would just get on a plane, grab a shopping cart, and help complete strangers.
Yes.
I mean, complete strangers.
At the most traumatic moment, perhaps, of their life.
Yeah.
And so my message really is, the reason I wanted to read this is, I don't know if Joe had a whiteboard where it said save the world, but only if you could.
Yeah.
He told me in a phone call, he said, I went to the border, I had no plan. He said, and I was at this same border, by the way, and it became a tent city, World Central Kitchen. And, he said there were people all over doing all kinds of things to help people. He said, but that's not how I wanted to help people, because that was kind of not that it wasn't important, but it was kind of an assembly line. You got your coffee, you got your sandwich, you got your health care. He said, I wanted to help. They were helping lots of people a little bit. He said, I wanted to help a few people a lot. And so I don't know, he must have taken a lot of cash or kept hitting an ATM machine or something.
Wow.
But the point I really want to make is, and this is not about Ukraine, it's about life. And that is, there may be something more you can do that will change someone else's life. Like I said, on January 1st, 2022, I didn't, none of this was
Right.
on my radar. I thought we were going to
Right.
hang out and play with the dog
Right.
and, maybe take a little trip. And I did take a little trip.
Yeah.
So I think if Joe was here, and if you'd like to talk to him someday, he's a fascinating guy.
Yeah.
His life will never be the same because of what he did for those people from Ukraine. He's still, he got people apartments in other parts of Europe. He helped them pay for it. He's become like the fairy godfather to these families. I look at my time there, my life will never be the same because of this. And that, you can't buy that.
Gregg, as you were telling the story, I was reminded of a sign that I have in my conference room. And the quote, and I wish I could tell you who said this, but the quote says, "To the world, you may be one person, but to one person, you are the world."
Yes.
What I want to say to you, my friend, is thank you for coming in today. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing Ilya's story in this book, and for giving us kind of a perspective that we otherwise would not have had. There's a lot to be excited about. This is such a difficult time for the people of Ukraine, as well as the people of Russia. And, if what you have done through this book and through your incredible communication skills and your energy and your willingness to come back to the United States and let us all know what's going on over there and what the future could look like, all I can say is thank you. Thank you so much for coming in today. Thank you for sharing the message with me, with my team, with our viewers, the listeners. And all I can say is, let me know how I can help. Because,
thank you.
We can make a difference. Look at one person. You are one person. And look at the impact you're having on the world.
Well, and just, to go back to the idea that there's something we can all do, if I just sit at home and think about the trip I just made and don't talk to you and share it with you and share it with your audience, and your audience will share it with someone else, and I hope you'll share it with other people. I know you will.
Yeah.
There's actually an entire chapter of the book devoted to what we're talking about right here, which is it's going to feel awkward for us in the West to rally behind the Russian people the way we've rallied behind the Ukrainians, because it's easy to rally behind the Ukrainians. They're victims. But the Russian people are victims too. And in some way, their victimhood is harder because it's, the Ukrainians were free and lost their freedom and they're fighting for their homeland. If you come in my house, I'm invaded.
Yeah.
The Russians were invaded a long time ago and largely psychologically. But I think the more the Russian people know that we have their back, the way we have the Ukrainian people's back, I think it's ultimately going to make a huge, huge difference for them. And it's going to be hard for us. It's hard to look at the country that's doing what it's doing and then thinking, but I need to support the people so they can fight for a change. But they can fight for a change. They're not fighting for it now in the kind of numbers we need, but they can, and I believe they will. And I think us cheering them on is going to make an amazing difference, and we're going to live in a better world because of it.
And you know, Greg, I am reminded of a dear friend of mine whose father wrote a book after World War II. He was a German soldier, and he wrote the book from the perspective of being a soldier under Hitler.
Yes.
And having that kind of that psychological, brainwashing, and he just had to do what he had to do. Otherwise, it's so interesting because what you just said reminds me of what he went through, and he came to America and he experienced what America is all about. And it was only until he got here that he realized, wow, that was incredible that I actually did those things and was willing to go to that degree for something that somebody just said you have to do. And
held a gun to his head.
Held a gun, right, exactly. And maybe Putin isn't holding a, well, he is holding a gun to people's heads. And so it's just, it is really interesting, and I think that there's a lot to be learned from that experience with Hitler, and I know a lot of comparisons are being made. And again, we're learning from history. The other thing I'm going to say is, and this is a practical statement, is that what I've learned is that when you look back at every war, the nation that lost because of one reason. It was logistics. And Russia's not doing so hot in that area. It's logistics. It's getting stuff to the front line. It's getting the right diesel, the food, all of those supplies.
And the right soldiers.
And the right soldiers, exactly. And trained soldiers.
Right.
So it is going to be interesting how this thing unfolds. I hope Ilya can, do what he needs to do for the Russian people as well as the people in Ukraine. Got to rebuild that country. It's amazing. And their leader is really interesting, really amazing. So, Gregg, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate the friendship that we have. And thanks to all of you for tuning in, listening to us today, watching the videos. Please feel free to share this information. Get the book. Just you know Gregg, you know me. He's objective. He's going to give it to you straight. It's a great book with lots of interesting questions, especially towards the end. He answers more questions than I had. He has a way of coming up with different perspectives, ideas, and questions to really test a theory and test an idea, which is really what is unfolding. So thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to hear more about this, let us know. Go onto our website at keyfinancialinc.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to hear about anything else, let us know about that too. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great day.